In this video, we're going to discuss indirect reflexives in indirect statement, and we're going to discuss Nego with indirect statement. These topics are covered in the grammar for 4A. Your book on page 202 discusses reflexives, but it doesn't really completely cover indirect reflexives, and it doesn't use that term. I'm introducing it now because you'll need to know it. And on page 203, it talks about Nego with indirect statement. You may remember our old friend, the reflexive pronoun. It, of course, has no nominative, but after that, the accusative is se, genitive is sui, dative is sibi, and the ablative is se, sui, sibi, se. And it's used in the third person, so it can mean himself, herself, itself, or themselves. A direct reflexive pronoun refers back to the subject of its own clause. Both English and Latin have direct reflexives. For instance, in Latin we say Marcus se amat, and that becomes in English, Marcus loves himself. In these cases, the reflexive pronoun se, in the case of Latin, and the reflexive pronoun himself, in the case of English, is referring back to the subject of its own clause. Here's another example. Marcus de sibi odio. Marcus is a source of hatred to himself. Again, the sibi is referring back to the subject Marcus. And in English, that would be Marcus is a source of hatred to himself. Again, we'd use himself to refer back to the subject. These are, again, examples of direct reflexives. In addition to direct reflexives, Latin has indirect reflexives. English does not have these. It does not have indirect reflexives, so they can be a little bit confusing to English speakers at first. An indirect reflexive is a reflexive in a subordinate clause that refers not to the subject of its own clause, but to the subject of a main clause. Don't worry if you didn't get this terminology, you'll understand by example. So let's get to some examples. Let's look at this sentence here. Marcus scit Juliam se amare. This can certainly mean Marcus knows that Julia loves herself. Here, se, the reflexive, is referring back to the subject of its own verb, which is amare, right? So it's referring directly back within its own clause, the subject of its own, the verb on which it is dependent. Marcus knows that Julia loves herself. That's a good example of a direct reflexive. But in fact, in Latin, there's another way to interpret the sentence, which is actually more likely. It could be that we're dealing with an indirect reflexive. An indirect reflexive, as in this situation, refers not to the subject of its own clause, but rather to the subject of the main clause, on which its clause is dependent. And this would then mean Marcus knows that Julia loves him. So the se is referring to Marcus. So Marcus knows that Julia loves him. Latin literally says Marcus knows Julia to love himself. And indirect reflexives like that are actually mandatory in Latin. They aren't optional. Let's say we want to translate the sentence, Marcus knows that Julia loves him. There's actually an ambiguity in English. Is this him the same as Marcus? Or is this him someone else, like Frank or Bob or Sam? Well, in Latin, that ambiguity doesn't exist. Because if you want to say that this him is Marcus, you must use the reflexive. You must say Marcus knows Julia to love himself. You must use reflexive. If you use eum, which is the other word that we've learned for him in Latin, and you would say Marcus scit Juliam eum amare, this cannot be Marcus. If in this indirect statement we refer back to the subject of the main verb here, we must use the reflexive. This cannot be Marcus. So Latin doesn't have that ambiguity that English has. When Latin says Marcus knows that Julia loves him, it must specify whether the him is Marcus or someone else. Here's another example. Let's say we want to say that Marcus says that he will leave. Again, the question arises, is he Marcus or someone else? Well, that ambiguity doesn't exist in Latin. In Latin, if it's Marcus, then you have to say Marcus dicut se abiturum esse. Marcus says himself to be going to leave, with the reflexive here. If the he is someone else, it's going to be like, or excuse me, that's Marcus there. That's Marcus. If the he is someone else, it's going to be eum. Marcus dicut eum abiturum esse. This eum here cannot be Marcus. It must be someone else. So again, there's an ambiguity in English here, whether this is Marcus or not, which does not exist in Latin, because Latin enforces the use of indirect reflexives. If in an indirect statement you refer back to the subject of the main verb of a sentence, you must use an indirect reflexive. Now let's move on to the topic of nego. For some strange reason, Latin doesn't like to say things like, Bill said that Mary did not eat. Instead it says, Bill denied that Mary ate. So Latin doesn't like to say not. In other words, it doesn't use the word dico and then have a not in the indirect statement after the dico. It doesn't like to do that. Instead, it uses a word that means deny. So it uses the Latin word for deny. The word for deny in Latin is nego, negari, negavi, negatus. So let's say we want to say that Marcus says that Julia doesn't love him. You must say in Latin, Marcus negat Juliam se amari. Marcus denies Julia to love him. You cannot use dico in this situation and then have a known here. That would be bad Latin. So instead of saying say ... not, Latin says negat. The end. This has been a Barking Blue Heeler production.